Weather Channel co-founder John Coleman called global warming the greatest scam in history while speaking at a recent climate change conference in Las Vegas. His opinion was echoed by ecologist Patrick Moore, who spoke against the idea of human activity being tied to extreme weather events. This is a little over an hour.
Now, getting to the program here, last evening there was talk from various folks where people bring up the left and the right, liberals and conservatives, and I just wanted to from my own heart, say that during this climate science debate, during the course of this debate, I've run across, I've made friends with, shared opinions with folks on all sides of the political spectrum. There are so-called skeptics who are liberals, who are socialists, who are, you name it, we're on the political spectrum. There are so-called alarmists who are generally conservative on other issues, whatever. In my personal opinion, I think that the reason why you see more conservatives being skeptics is because the so-called prescriptions that are being advocated for the alleged global warming crisis, they involve big government. They involve giving more money and power to government, to infringing upon people's rights to choose their electricity sources, et cetera. And so therefore, we're going to have an initial skepticism where we want to make sure that it's justified. I mean, if we're destroying the planet, well, then you got to do something about it. But let's make sure that we're destroying the planet before we destroy our economy or our individual liberties. But nevertheless, I want to make it clear that no matter where we stand on the political spectrum, at the Heartland Institute, we're a free market think tank. And so you're going to see that reflected. But we certainly respect and welcome all perspectives, and that should be the case on all sides of the debate. So we're happy to have all of you here. It's not just left and right also. It's interesting how so many folks that are global warming skeptics come from environmental activist backgrounds. And we could say environmental activists, we can say environmentalists in general. I consider myself an environmentalist. I do travel quite a bit, and every chance I get when I travel, I want to go out. I want to see the lay of the land. I want to go out hiking through the forest. I want to experience the beauty that we have in this country, and I want to make sure that we're good stewards of it. Sometimes, however, that doesn't mean we're just going to jump on board for every asserted environmental crisis. Like I mentioned earlier, some of us, we want to see the proof in the pudding before we jump on board. It takes courage, if you are concerned about the environment, to critically examine some of the assertions, some of the environmental activist assertions. Sometimes to stand up and say, all right, I'm very concerned about this issue, I want to do something about it, but this one the science doesn't justify it, and I'm going to stand up for truth. And I'm very proud and honored to introduce this morning a man who has done that throughout his life and continues to this day. Dr. Patrick Moore has been a leader in the international environmental field for over 30 years. He is a founding member of Greenpeace and served for 9 years as president of Greenpeace Canada and 7 years as a director of Greenpeace International. As the leader of many campaigns, Dr. Moore was a driving force shaping policy and direction while Greenpeace became the world's largest environmental activist organization. In recent years, Dr. Moore has focused on the promotion of sustainability and consensus building among competing concerns. As chair of the Sustainable Forestry Committee of the Forest Alliance of British Columbia, he leads the process of developing the principles of sustainable forestry, which have been advocated by a majority of the industry. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Patrick Moore.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everyone, and thanks very much to the Heartland Institute for inviting me here to present my thoughts on the subject of climate change. But first, let me give you a little thumbnail of where I've come from over these many years. This was my home for my first 14 years, a small logging camp on the northwest tip of Vancouver Island in the rainforest by the Pacific. I didn't realize how lucky I was. There's the town today, growing up, playing on the tide flats by the salmon spawning streams in the rainforest until I was sent off to Vancouver to boarding school, eventually finding myself at the University of British Columbia studying the life sciences, biology, biochemistry, genetics, a little forestry. And then in the mid-1960s, before the word was known to the general public, I discovered the science of ecology. the science of how all things are interrelated and how people are related to them. And in the mid-1960s, at the height of the Vietnam War, the height of the Cold War, and the threat of all-out nuclear war, and the growing concern for the environment, I was transformed into a radical environmental activist. I can't seem to get it to go that way anymore. I found myself in a church basement with a like-minded group planning a protest voyage against U.S. hydrogen bomb testing in Alaska. We proved that a somewhat ragtag-looking bunch, that's me under the P in '71, could sail a leaky old halibut boat across the North Pacific, help galvanize public opposition to the tests, and change the course of history. That turned out to be the last hydrogen bomb the United States ever detonated. President Nixon canceled the remaining tests in the series due to the overwhelming opposition we had spearheaded. On our way back from Alaska, we were welcomed into the big house of the Namgis Nation at Alert Bay, near my northern Vancouver Island home, where they made us brothers of the tribe. For this began for Greenpeace the tradition of the warriors of the rainbow. It's after a Cree legend that says one day when the skies are black and the birds fall dead and the waters are poisoned, that people around the world will join together to save the earth. We named our ship the Rainbow Warrior, and I spent the next 15 years full-time on the front lines of the movement around the world. Next, we took on French atmospheric nuclear testing in the South Pacific. France was still detonating hydrogen and atomic bombs in the air in the early '70s, sending radiation around the world. They were a little more difficult. It took some years to drive these nuclear tests underground. And as late as 1985, under direct orders from President Mitterrand, French commandos bombed and sank the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbor, killing our photographer. Going back again to the '70s, here I am driving a small rubber boat into the first encounter with the Soviet factory whaling fleet in the North Pacific in 1975. We confronted the whalers, putting ourselves in front of their harpoons and our boats to protect the fleeing whales. This got us on television around the world, bringing the Save the Whales movement into everyone's living room for the first time. Just 4 years later, factory whaling was banned in the North Pacific and eventually in all the world's oceans. Here I'm sitting on a baby seal off the east coast of Newfoundland to protect it from the Hunters Club. I was arrested and hauled off to jail. The seal was clubbed and skinned, but this picture appeared in over 3,000 newspapers around the world the next morning. This and many other direct actions eventually brought changes to the way Canada manages its seal herds. Anyways, by the mid-'80s, we'd grown from a church basement into a group with $100 million a year coming in and offices in 20 countries around the world. Presidents and prime ministers now spoke of the environment on a regular basis. But for me, it was time to make a change. I had been against at least 3 or 4 things every day of my life for 15 years. I decided it was time to try and figure out what I was in favor of for a change. I made the transition from the politics of confrontation, which is basically about telling people what they should stop doing, to the politics of trying to find consensus about what we should do instead. There is no escaping the fact that 7 billion people wake up every morning on this planet with real needs for food, energy, and materials. Sustainability, which for me was the next logical step after environmental activism, is partly about continuing to provide for those needs, maybe even getting a little more food and energy for people in the developing world, while at the same time constantly striving to reduce the negative impact caused by getting the food, energy, and material from the Earth's environment. Anyways, I could go on forever, but that's my story from the early years. Why did I leave Greenpeace after 15 years? When I began with Greenpeace, we had a strong humanitarian orientation to stop all-out nuclear war, to save civilization from destruction. By the time I left 15 years later, that's the peace in Greenpeace, of course. By the time I left 15 years later, Greenpeace had drifted into a position along with the rest of the movement as characterizing humans as the enemies of the earth. And that was not for me. We are part of nature and from nature. Greenpeace also began to adopt positions I didn't agree with from a scientific point of view. Ban chlorine worldwide became one of the slogans No matter how much I tried, it didn't matter that I was trying to convince them that chlorine is the most important element for public health and medicine, which it is. Adding it to drinking water is the biggest advance in the history of public health, and 75% of our synthetic pharmaceuticals are chlorine-based chemistry. Anyways, I had to leave because of that. And here, look at them today in the Philippines with a mask on in a parade, golden rice, which could help cure 2 million kids from dying each year, and they associate it with death in order to scare parents about something that can actually prevent their children from dying by the hundreds of thousands and millions every year. So that's where Greenpeace went, and I didn't want to go there. I'll just tell you about forests for 1 second because it's the most important thing, and it actually has a lot to do with climate. But wood is the most important renewable energy source in the world, it's the most important renewable material resource in the world, and it is the most important sequester of carbon in the world if you're concerned with that. And yet my old friends in Greenpeace are basically against forestry. In other words, opposed to the most important renewable resource in the world. We should be growing more trees and using more wood. Many activists argue we should cut fewer trees and use less wood. But this is the correct environmental point of view. But look at what Greenpeace does to this. Here's what the IPCC says. They're actually correct on this, except it takes them 38 bureaucratic words to say it. In the long term, a sustainable forest management strategy aimed at maintaining or increasing forest carbon stocks, that's what they call trees, while producing an annual sustained yield of timber, fiber, or energy from the forest will generate the largest sustained mitigation benefit, means the best thing to do. In other words, they're saying use trees instead of using steel and concrete wherever you can, and you will reduce energy consumption and you will be using something renewable. Greenpeace says, the IPCC says the easiest and cheapest way to fight climate change is to, quote, leave trees standing and protect its biodiversity, unquote. When I challenged this, the Greenpeace person said, oh, I didn't mean to put quotes around it, I was just paraphrasing. But that's a lie too. It isn't a paraphrase. What the IPCC is saying is grow more trees and use more wood. 6 words. Of course, there are many opinions about climate change. There is the IPCC, which says, sorry, well, how did that get there? That must have, wow, yeah, that got reversed in the translation there somehow. Read the second one first. You know it all. It's extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. Extremely likely. Does it make it more likely to put the word extremely in front of likely? They say yes. They say that means 99%, because very likely is 90%. And so they put percents along with adjectives that go with likely. What it turns out, actually, is that this is not a scientific word at all, likely. And even in the IPCC report, it says it's an expert judgment in the same paragraph as they say this extremely likely. An expert judgment is not a fact, it is an opinion. This is an opinion, so let them have their opinion, but they should make it clear that it's an opinion. Oh, sorry, back up here. Whoa. Okay, start over again. Anyways, this is what, wow, I got too far back, didn't I? There I go. This is what the Global Warming Petition Project, 31,000 scientists and professionals, all from the United States. This isn't even an international list, so much for your consensus. But I put my faith in the late Michael Crichton, who said, I'm certain there's too much certainty in the world. And this is where this hubris comes in, this certainty that they are right comes in. And you cannot say you're certain that you're right when someone who's in authority is saying it's extremely likely. That isn't certainty. Anyways, we all know about this, and from here I'm just going to show you what I show people, because you all mostly know this, but here's how I show it to people. First, yes, CO2 is increasing in the global atmosphere. But let's look at the last billion years of global climate change. I chose the most recent billion years. There is actually 3.5 more billion years of climate change before this. But we know pretty well that this is what has happened over the last billion. It's generally been warmer than it is today by many degrees Celsius. 22 degrees average global temperature has been the norm, but then there have been 4.5 ice ages during this period of time where temperature plummets on average down to 12 degrees, even 10 degrees Celsius global average. Today, the global average temperature is 14.5 degrees Celsius. We are in an ice age called the Pleistocene. That's why both poles are covered in ice. People don't understand that we are in an ice age now. This is an interglacial period within the Pleistocene ice age, and it is generally a cold time in terms of the Earth's history. Why are there 300 million people in the United States and only 30 million people in Canada? One word: cold. Sometimes I think that's why you let us have it. And you saw this graph yesterday in a different format, but anyways, it's the most recent 600 million years since modern life emerged during the Cambrian explosion, and it shows very clearly that there's no lockstep correlation between CO2 and global temperature. At times, they seem to be moving in a similar direction. In other words, there seems to be correlation sometimes, but as you know, correlation doesn't prove causation, and you'd need to see a lot more of a lockstep relationship. It seems that temperature is bounded on the top and the bottom, probably by a lot of feedback forces that are creating a maximum and minimum, and we're in one of those minimums right now. Yeah, it shows right there, for example, that now it's 14.5 C and CO2 is about 400, whereas the average over the last 600 million years has been around 2,000, which coincidentally is the optimum CO2 level for plant growth, about 4 to 5 times higher than it is today. That's why greenhouse growers purposely put the exhaust from their gas or wood heaters into the greenhouse to increase growth by as much as 100%. So we can look forward to increasing productivity in agriculture from increased CO2, as many of you know. Now, this to me is the graph, if you accept this as true, which it probably is something like true, because it has been warming for the last 100 years or so. The IPCC says that we've been the dominant cause since the mid-20th century. That's 1950. In other words, they do not ascribe the rise in temperature between 1910 and 1940, which you see there, to human-caused emissions, because we weren't emitting much back then. They only say it's the part between 1970 and the year 2000 that was caused by humans. Then what caused the rise in temperature between 1910 and 1940? Because it is identical in duration and size, 0.4 degrees over 30 years. They're both the same. It is not logical to be extremely likely that the second one is caused by us and the first one is caused by something else, which they don't really say what it is. So this, to me, demonstrates the logical fallacy of claiming that we are the dominant cause of global warming. Many of you have seen this. There has been no increase in global temperature for 17 years and 10 months and running. And then here is the United States for the last 10 years. The temperature has actually declined by a significant amount. And the polar vortex had something to do with this, I think. But no, I forgot, that was warming. That's right, yeah, I shouldn't make that mistake again. And here, of course, is the Arctic sea ice, which has, right now, is nearly 1 million square kilometers below its average since 1979, when we first started measuring it from a satellite. We have no idea what the extent of Arctic sea ice was before then, but somehow or other, Amundsen got through there with an 8-horsepower motor and a wooden boat in 1904. And the Canadian ship St. Roch got through there in 1942 or 4, both ways back and forth with a small engine, without a big icebreaker. So, what was it? Who knows what it was like back then during the heat wave of the 1930s into the 40s. And here, of course, is the Southern Ocean, where if you take the difference between the Antarctic and the Arctic, there is now nearly 1 million square miles more sea ice than the average since we started measuring it in 1979. And this is the sum total of our knowledge about sea ice. And apparently this is also due to global warming, the increasing extent of sea ice in the Antarctic, whereas the decreasing extent of sea ice in the Arctic is also due to global warming. So I get it. Everything is due to global warming. It's funny, but our children are not taught logic, they are not taught what the scientific method is, and they are taught that carbon is pollution. Oh, carbon dioxide, sorry. They're told it's carbon now, as if it was soot. This is sea level rise post-glaciation. The rapid rise in sea level all occurred between really 16,000 and 7,000 years ago, when the huge 2-mile thick low altitude, mid-latitude glaciers all disappeared. And since then, it's just been a very slow, gradual rise as more of the ice that was left in high mountains and the poles melts a little more too. You saw this yesterday. This is tropical hurricane energy worldwide. Al Gore knows about this, yet he continues to say that it's going to be a devastation of the earth from massive hurricanes. No such thing. And of course, you know that this is the longest period in the history of measuring hurricanes since a Category 3 or larger hurricane hit the continental United States. Right now, today, is the longest period we've known. So that one really, and even the IPCC does not subscribe to the belief that extreme weather events are tied to global warming, whether it's human-caused or not. They say there is no evidence of an increase in extreme weather events related to the warming that has occurred. And yet, Bill McKibben and co., Al Gore, the whole bunch of them, perpetuate the idea that every extreme weather event is because of us. This is why we will never be able to predict the future of the climate other than about 3 days out, as John Coleman, who's coming up soon, will probably tell you he knows. It's because of clouds. Water, the most important greenhouse gas, is the only one that occurs in both liquid and gaseous phases in the atmosphere. And the liquid phase of water and the gaseous phase of water, which we call water vapor, behave in completely different way with regard to solar energy. Clouds can reflect the sun back, they can hold the heat in, depending on where they are and how thick they are, and what computer model can predict the pattern of clouds in the world? It's impossible. That is why we will never be able to predict the future of climate, and clouds are the wild card, and many people believe that as the earth warms and more water evaporates off the sea, it will be cloudier and wetter, and that will reflect more sunlight back. In other words, there will be a negative feedback against the effect of CO2, and that is just as plausible a hypothesis as the fry in hell hypothesis that we keep getting from the alarmists. As a matter of fact, it's probably a more plausible hypothesis. CO2 is the most important nutrient for all life on Earth. Please teach the children this. When we started emitting CO2, it was down to about 260 ppm. Now it's at 400. If it had gone down by the same amount as we've caused it to go up, plants would have started dying, because plants start dying at 150 ppm. Below that, and one of the reasons the CO2 has fluctuated during the glaciation we've had in the last 2.5 million years, is because when the plants start dying, they emit the CO2 that they hold, the carbon that they hold as CO2, and then it gets better again. And so we've been skipping along on top of this low point for CO2 for a long time now, and it's about time somebody did something about it. James Lovelock, the father of the Gaia hypothesis, was an extreme pessimist about climate and said that humans are a rogue species. He has changed his mind. He realizes that if Gaia is all one great organism, that maybe we're doing her bidding. It's like Carlin said, the reason people came into existence is because the Earth wants plastic. And maybe the reason people came into existence is because the atmosphere wants a little more carbon dioxide for the plants. Who knows? 88% of world energy. I'm just going to do a little bit of energy here, because especially to people concerned about human-caused climate change, energy is the flip side of the coin, and global energy policy is what they want to get their hands on, as if there's some kind of dial you can turn somewhere that is going to change the climate. They want to stop this 88% of world energy produced by fossil fuels, and especially the part where oil is involved, where there really aren't many substitutes, because that's transportation, getting the food into the stores. Hydroelectric produces 20% of global electricity, the most important and cost-effective source of renewable energy. Greenpeace and the rest of them are against it. They're against wood, the most important renewable in the world. They're against hydro, the second most important renewable in the world. And between the two of them on an energy side, it adds up to about 85% of all the renewable energy in the world, and they are against it, even though it's reliable, cost-effective, etc. Three Gorges Dam, Greenpeace succeeded in getting the World Bank to pull the funding from this. Thankfully, we buy enough flat-screen TVs from those guys that they could afford to build it without the World Bank, and they did. It replaces 40 coal-fired power plants. If you're worried about emissions from coal plants, it stops floods from killing thousands of people downstream in bad flood years, and it allows them to irrigate twice as much land. This is a sustainable development. And Canada, we up north get 60% of our electricity from hydro, but oh, they're against that. When the oil and coal and gas become scarce, this is what we're going to have to use. There is no question of that in my mind. So let's work on making it even safer than it is, which is already safer than every other major energy technology we have. 21 countries producing 15%. This used nuclear fuel that they want to dump in Nevada is actually one of our most important future energy resources. We know how to do it. Fast neutron reactors. The Russians have 2 of them running on the Caspian Sea. They just sold 2 to China last year. This is where we go. But we got lots of coal and oil and gas right now, and it's cheaper than doing this, so maybe it'll take a while. But you know what? In 300 years from now, all of the fission products in there pretty well will be decayed, and then it'll be just the good stuff left. So it won't matter if it takes 300 years before we start using that. But there is 5,000 years worth of nuclear energy in the 50 years worth of waste, so-called, that we've produced. Nuclear and hydro are the only energy sources that can effectively replace fossil fuels, if that's what you're worried about. These are too expensive for the grid. A sustainability officer on Long Island described solar panels as a wealth-destroying technology. Here's a cost-effective use of solar energy to heat water, especially in sunny places. And this is the wind energy going in the world. It's only rich countries, mainly China in Asia, and then there's Europe and North America, putting all this stuff in. These are things that are going to be left rusting on the ground. Here's what happens with wind energy. One day you have 12,000 megawatts, the next day you got nothing. What do you do on the nothing day? Shut the schools, factories, hospitals, office buildings? Go home? No. You start a coal plant. That's what they're doing in Germany. In Germany, CO2 emissions and coal consumption has increased for the last 3 years running, while they call themselves the greenest energy country on earth. In the United States, because gas is replacing coal, in some areas, CO2 emissions have gone down steadily for the last 5 years, without any massive government intervention. Greenpeace's fossil fuel dilemma. Their new $32 million ship, they say it's powered by super efficient electric motors and the wind, powered by the wind, as if the wind is powering the super efficient electric motors. Here they are protesting a coal plant being built on the shores of the Netherlands with all these wind farms around it. And Greenpeace says, you should be like us. You should power yourself with the wind. Don't build that coal plant. What's in the basement of that boat? 2 big diesel engines. That's how they power the super efficient electric motors. And if the wind isn't blowing, they have to fire them up. Or if it isn't blowing in the direction they want to go that day, they have to fire them up. This is called sail assist. And those windmills are wind assist for the coal plant when the wind is blowing. When it isn't, turn on the coal plant, just like Greenpeace turns on their diesel engines. Here's Greenpeace protesting a Russian oil rig with an oil-powered ship, saying we must end our addiction to oil. Is this hypocrisy? I think so. Now, let me just talk for a moment about something in my country that is being denigrated and demonized around the world, and that is the Canadian oil sands. And here's one of the upgraders there, which turns dirty bitumen oil taken off the sand. They are cleaning the sand in the world's largest natural oil spill. When the Rocky Mountains heaved up, the oil that was in deep formations flowed out into the sands of the prairies, which is a former ocean bottom. And there it is near the surface now. But it's got to be cleaned up, just like a gas station when a little fuel leaks out of the tanks underground. You know, makes the oil in the dirt thing. It costs $1 million to clean one of those up. We're making a profit cleaning up the oil off the sand in Canada. Here's what oil sands mining in Canada looks like. It's a dirty business. It's true. It doesn't look too pretty when you open up the earth to get the sand out. But here's coal mining in the United States, which produces 15 times as much CO2 emissions as all of the oil sands in Canada. And I know that they're targeting this down here too, but that there looks like pretty good energy to me. Here's a map, Google Earth, showing the western half of Canada, therefore about half the boreal forest of Canada. They say that the oil sands is destroying Canada's boreal forest. You can see it there, barely. It's like a pimple on an elephant. And there's Edmonton, where you can see Edmonton down there too. When are they going to reclaim Edmonton? Or Las Vegas, for example. When are they going to turn this back into a desert ecosystem? Because in the oil sands, every square inch of disturbed land must by law be put back to a native ecosystem, as this piece has, as this tailings pond, which looked pretty damn ugly when the operation was going on, but once they finished with that tailings pond, they turned it into a bison pasture run by the First Nations Indian people who live nearby, getting $85 million a year from the oil sands in First Nations contracts. This is all reclaimed mining land, and so is this. And as an ecologist and environmentalist for over 40 years of my short life, this is good enough for me, and it should be good enough for everybody. Thank you very much for listening to me this morning. You can follow me on Twitter at ecosense.now. I have a big campaign going on golden rice around the world, and I think you'll find it of interest. I didn't have time to talk about it today. And we're talking about all the environmental issues there on EcoSense now. Climate change, GMOs, nuclear energy, and all those topics. And I think you'll find it interesting if you're into following tweets to come and join the conversation with me. Again, thank you very much for listening to me this morning. Oh, I just wanted to mention one more thing. John L. Smith, if you are here, your Las Vegas Review-Journal article is garbage. Thank you.
Wonderful job, Patrick.
Thanks, James. Thank you. Thanks very much. I appreciate it.
My, what a wonderful talk. See, it was worth getting up this early after your 4 hours sleep from the craps tables, blackjack tables, etc. But the one thing that I'm taking away from your talk, more than anything else, is, quote, everything is due to global warming. And when Dr. Moore said that, I couldn't help but think of one of my favorite movies, The Outlaw Josie Wales. And I hope most of you have seen this. So there's a particular scene where Clint Eastwood, he's leading this entourage across the country here. And he's chewing on this big old chaw of tobacco. And approaching the party comes this snake oil salesman. And he's got this bright white fancy suit on. And as he comes across Josie Wales, Clint Eastwood, and his crew, he looks to the Native American, the Cherokee chief, and says, "This snake oil is especially good for curing those who can't hold their liquor." Then he turns to a young man who's been wounded and says, "It's very good at cleaning out wounds and restoring health." And Josie Wales, chewing on his tobacco, says, "There's just about nothing it can't do, huh? It can do just about anything." He says, "Yes, sir, that it can." And Josie goes, spits all over his white suit. How is it on stains? Sometimes I feel like that snake oil salesman's even a little bit more credible than the alarmists who've been putting up the garbage that Patrick Moore debunked just now, so thank you so much. One of the things that also just cracks me up is oftentimes I'll have folks, usually in the media, after I'll give a talk or when we're talking about the issue, and they'll say, but all the skeptics, they're so old, as if this is a horrible thing. And there are a couple reasons it stands to reason. It makes sense. First of all, if you're a young professorial candidate, if you're looking for tenure, if you're looking for research dollars, it's like whack-a-mole. You stick up your head, you say, wait a second, IPCC is wrong, bam! No tenure for you. No funding for you. That's one reason why you'll see some of the younger folks just kind of let me bide my time. Of course, I can also point out some of the scientists who are younger who nevertheless have the courage to speak up. Willie Soon, Craig Idso, Joe Bastardi, Jennifer Merohesi, Sebastian Leuning, they're all here. But one thing that really jumps out at me about this ageism, how is it that folks who have been working in this field their entire lives, if you've put in 10, 20, 30, 40 years of experience, all of a sudden all that experience, not only is it worth nothing, it's a negative. Well, it has nothing to do with age, it has to do with experience. You have some folks who I've mentioned who've been working in the field for a long time, but when you pull together that experience, it tells you something. Joe Bastardi, as he was mentioning the hurricanes in 38 and 44 last night, he was mentioning in times past in the early 20th century when the PDO and the AMO were in different phases. And that wasn't just preparation for his talk. Go talk to Joe Bastardi. He'll be reeling them off the top of his head. He knows his history. He has experience. He can put all these so-called alarms in proper context. That's why the folks who are skeptics look at this and say, wait a minute. We've come across this before. We came across this with the global cooling scare. We've come across this when temperatures were warming and we saw how it turned out. And let's make sure we have all our facts straight. It's not so much age, it's experience and it's courage. Now, I have the pleasure this morning of introducing to you a man who has been working in the weather industry for more than 60 years. He has seen it all. He knows the proper context of weather and climate events. John Coleman began his career in 1953 at WCIA in Champaign, Illinois, where he was a student at the University of Illinois. He went on to work at stations in Peoria, Omaha, Milwaukee, and Chicago before becoming the original weatherman on ABC's Good Morning America. In the early 1980s, Coleman helped establish the Weather Channel, serving as CEO and president during its first year of operation. He joined KUSI in San Diego 20 years ago, and earlier this spring, after 60-plus years in the industry, announced he was finally stepping back a little bit to enjoy his private life. And just in case you think his recent retirement is slowing John down, just last month, he made it to the cashier in a World Series of Poker official bracelet event. So you're my hero, John. It's my pleasure to introduce to you John Coleman.
Oh, James, thank you very much, and hello, everybody. This is spectacular to be here with you today. I want to begin first by asking Joe and Diane Bask to stand up. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the people who make this event possible. These are my biggest heroes. Stand up, Diane. Stand up, Diane. She's not here. Wherever she is, she may be out at the reception desk. Now, while I was sitting at the table having my breakfast here this morning, I was watching the live stream of this event on the internet on my cell phone. That's the way most of the world is watching video today. And I hope there are thousands and thousands of you watching this live stream. And I hope and pray that you will go to the Heartland website and donate to Joe and his organization for the hundreds of thousands of dollars that putting on these global warming conferences cost them. It is a spectacular achievement that they make it happen, but they can use support from people around the world to keep this battle going, to correct this bad science. In this room here today with me are my heroes. These men and women who have stepped forward and put aside their professional status and not worried about who respects them or likes them, but stepped forward to say, ladies and gentlemen, there is bad science today, this global warming thing that is so popular politically, so popular with the environmentalists, so popular with the politicians. This bad science must be corrected. And they have had what it takes, which is incredible intestinal fortitude, to step forward. And many of them are brilliant, as we just heard from Patrick Moore. And to these men and women, I tell you, I am honored to stand before you today, and I greatly respect you, and I honor you. We have just been through the coldest winter in 30 years in the United States. It snowed and it froze, and thousands of temperature records were set across our country. And I couldn't resist sending out this tweet to the Democratic Party and the Sierra Club and to all the rest. Al Gore, my friend, where the heck is your global warming? Today, I am not going to talk about the science. Patrick has done a beautiful job, and we will have sessions throughout the day where great scientists with PhDs give you a wonderful scientific presentation. But instead, I am going to concentrate as a journalist, and I'm also a journalism graduate, on my journalism investigation, in which I determined that there is a story behind this case of science gone bad, a story that everybody needs to know and understand. How did we get into this awful spot today? And it begins with this man, the great Roger Revelle. A great man, a great scientist, a powerful leader. Roger Revelle received a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley in oceanography. Then he became the head of the Scripps Oceanographic Institute after serving in the United States Navy during World War II. And as the director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, he found a way to greatly improve and expand that organization by obtaining huge government contracts to investigate the impact on the atmosphere and the ocean of our atomic testing in the atolls following World War II. And this small organization blossomed into a large scientific organization of great significance. And then he came to a real problem in his life. What can he do next to keep this organization thriving? Because the atomic test had come to an end, that government funding was coming to an end. He needed to do something more. And that's when he hired this man, Hans Suess, from the University of Chicago, a man who was an expert on carbon in the atmosphere, and with him produced the seminal paper on global warming in 1957. And in this paper, they looked at the increase in the atmospheric carbon dioxide caused by our burning of fossil fuels, coal and oil and gas. And they asked the question if this was having an impact on the climate of the world. Well, think about that period in our lives. Many of you are not old enough to remember, but I remember very well. Our cities and small towns were all clogged in the winter with a smog that hung heavily over us, and little particulates of carbon covered the walks and streets as our stokers burned dirty coal to heat us and get us through the winters. Oh my, we have done a wonder in cleaning up our atmosphere since then. But during that time, it was easy for people to say, oh, there must be something awful happening here. And that was it, that paper in 1957, by Revell and Seuss. That was the beginning of the global warming frenzy. And that's what launched what has continued today and what we are attempting to battle, and it's David versus Goliath for us as we fight this battle, but we'll keep fighting. Well, what happened next for Mr. Revell? He campaigned next to bring the University of California new campus to co-locate it with his Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla, a neighborhood of San Diego, California, and succeeded and brought that campus there. It was a huge accomplishment for this great man, but then he suffered the greatest failure in his life because he thought that he would become the chancellor of that university. He thought he would lead that great organization, and instead the politics interfered and another person was selected as chancellor. And here this great man was crushed. And this is what happened next. He left Scripps Institution of Oceanography and moved to Boston and joined Harvard University to start their organization for population studies. And so there he was in Boston, starting something brand new. But his work he had done at Scripps on carbon was still very much on his mind, and he brought it up in great detail in the first class he taught there. Do you know who his student was? There he is, sitting in the front row of that classroom, Al Gore. And what Revell and Seuss had begun, they transferred to Al Gore, the son of a tobacco farmer and politician from Tennessee. And Al Gore found a meaning for his life in that classroom. He was inspired by Revell, and he wrote a book, Earth in Balance, and with that book became elected to the United States Senate. And there in the United States Senate held hearings where he brought scientists before the Senate committees and amplified the cause of alarm from global warming and said, this is what we must do to correct it. We must spend our federal dollars on research to find ways to combat global warming. And as that money began to flow, the U.S. Congress and Al Gore took charge of the entire scientific organization across this nation in its climatology research and focused it on global warming. And there in the Senate of the United States, Al Gore proudly stood up and proclaimed that Roger Revell was his mentor and teacher, that he was the father of this global warming movement. And all of that was heard by this man, Maurice Strong, a former Canadian oil executive who is now a bureaucrat with the United Nations at the headquarters in New York City. And he organized the first environmental conference of the UN in Stockholm in 1972, based on what he had learned from Al Gore, who based what he had learned on Roger Revell. And there was born the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So it had all begun there with that one paper in 1957. It had all spread through that chance meeting of Roger Revell and his young student Al Gore in Boston at Harvard, and now it had taken over the United Nations as well, and this was it. Now we had a huge international global warming campaign underway. Around the world, science was focused on this great catastrophe unfolding because of man's use of fossil fuels. And there at their meetings, was it all scientists? Oh no, it was bureaucrats, politicians, environmentalists. It was a consortium of people with agendas of one world government led by taxation on the nations that burn fossil fuel to help the third world countries. And this was it. This was it. And the scientists were invited to international conferences at glamorous places around the world, and they compiled these great reports and issued them and published them. And the entire focus was adopted by the press around the world, and it became a great concern. And meanwhile, Al Gore is writing his second book, An Inconvenient Truth. And you know what happened from that sci-fi movie. And there's Al Gore with his Academy Award, An Inconvenient Truth, Best Documentary, 2007. And then Al Gore and the UNIPCC received the Nobel Prize. And the global warming scare has peaked, all beginning with that one innocent paper. That frenzy has reached its peak. The movie is shown in schools throughout the world, and we have little chance to be heard. The media has totally adopted it. But what happens to this man who started it all? He gave up on Harvard. He gave up on Boston. He gave up on the concept that the earth has overpopulated and we must worry about population growth. And that entire center was closed at Harvard. And Revelle came back to UCSD in his old hometown of San Diego and accepted a professorship. And what did he do there? He wrote these letters to congressmen and senators. And what did the letters say? You can read them. Look, folks, they say, we have perhaps become over-alarmed about global warming. We should give at least 20 years to study. We should be patient. We shouldn't take extreme measures today that will harm our civilization. Relax, wait, study, don't panic. The letters went out from Roger Revelle. His signature reached Washington. A United States senator, congressman, received the word from him. He said, I have started this global warming movement. I'm trying to stop the frenzy. And then he joined with Fred Singer and wrote an article, a paper that appeared in the new scientific magazine Cosmos. And what did that article say? What to do about global warming? Look before you leap. And it concluded that it is time for the scientific community to stand back and have a longer study to make sure that they have the data to justify taking any extreme measures to battle global warming. He had taken a strong position, Roger Revelle had. What did Al Gore say at that point? He said, Revelle has gone senile. And he declared that the debate was over, and he still declares it today. And as his great mentor, he said he was senile. I wondered about that, but I never got a chance to talk to Revelle about it. A heart attack, and we lost him in 1991. And then a great debate raged. On the one side, Fred Singer, who said Revelle had changed his mind and was trying to tell us that global warming was not a great crisis, but the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, the Revelle family, the UNIPCC, members of the US Senate, Congress, and the environmental movement said, no, Revelle is our champion. He's the father of global warming. And Singer, you have done a bad thing here. Well, I was able to interview Dr. Singer about this controversy. And he joins us live from Washington, D.C. Dr. Singer, what was Roger Revelle's view of carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas when you co-authored that Cosmos article back in 1990?
He was very relaxed about it. He basically looked at this as a grand geophysical experiment. After he and his collaborators, like David Keeling, found that CO2 was in fact increasing in the atmosphere, he and his colleagues were wondering if it would have any impact on climate. He wasn't about to make any judgment on the matter until the data were in. Of course, at that time, by 1990, we had about more than 10 years worth of satellite data, and the satellites didn't show any appreciable warming. And this is what actually set off my own thinking on the matter. I wondered what was going on. After all, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It's increasing. There's no question about that. Where is the warming? Well, it turns out that the atmosphere is much more complicated than the climate models believe, and the warming is offset probably by a kind of negative feedback that comes from clouds and water vapor in the atmosphere.
Well, are you saying that back in 1990 that Revelle was somewhat regretful of the excitement that he had caused about global warming?
Revelle, at that time, had written some letters to his congressman and also to Senator Wirth, telling him to calm down, not get excited about it, but wait and see what would happen to the climate. In other words, he was telling him, don't assume that things are going to warm up just because the models say so. Revelle actually was very skeptical of climate models, much more so than I was. I was always more optimistic, hoping that they would improve enough so that they could really simulate what's going on in the atmosphere. Revelle had not much faith in models.
Well, since that time, many people have said that you were the one who manipulated Revelle, that you kind of calmed him down or changed his feelings in the way you put that article together, that Gore said he was a senile old man when you co-authored that paper, and that therefore you took your position on CO2 and more or less assigned it to Revelle, and they put a lot of blame on you.
Well, that's absolutely untrue. First of all, if you knew Revelle, you would know that he was sharp to the very, very end, and you could not change his mind. I mean, he knew what he was doing all the time. And furthermore, we have written proof. We have the letters he wrote to his congressman and to the senator. We also have an interview in Omni magazine. So there's plenty of evidence to show that he was quite independent-minded and that he didn't believe in global warming until the data would show him a warming.
That full interview can be seen on my website, but it's perfectly clear that Singer was sure that there was a real change in heart in Roger Revelle, the man who had started the global warming movement. But at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, oh no, it continued strongly there, and in fact, they established the first Roger Revelle Award. And who got the Roger Revelle Award? Let me see if I can go back. I want this video to play. Can you trigger the video back there? This was the TV coverage in 2009 of that award to Al Gore, who stood before the group at the Scripps Institution.
Former Vice President Al Gore was honored tonight at Scripps Institution of Oceanography. He was given an award in recognition of his environmental work. KUSI's Tom Jordan is live in La Jolla with more on that. Tom?
Paul, Al Gore was the first ever recipient of the Roger Revelle Prize here at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, honored tonight for his work in environmental preservation. A rousing welcome for a man continuing his campaign on environmental awareness and protection. Former Vice President Al Gore being honored for his efforts with the first ever Roger Revelle Prize.
I want to express my very deep and genuine gratitude for this honor.
The award presented at this dinner marking the 100th birthday of the late Roger Revelle, who headed Scripps Institution of Oceanography from 1950 to 1964. Gore studied under Revelle at Harvard University in the 1960s and credits him for igniting his passion on the environment.
As a former student, still a student, trying to learn, but still inspired by a great teacher who was a great scientist and a great man.
Roger Revelle's work back in the 1960s was at the time considered revolutionary. Today, many scientists consider that work almost prophetic.
And at that time, they wrote a short report, and we were told it was a very short report, saying that climate change is becoming an issue, the Earth is heating up, and therefore something needs to be done about that.
Al Gore says he was deeply moved by Revelle's early work. He, now considered at the forefront of the global warming movement, a Nobel Peace Prize winner and Oscar-winning documentarian, all from his work on the environment. Now he adds a new distinguished and personal honor to that list.
I am deeply, deeply grateful.
And tonight's celebration was part of 3 days of celebrating the life of Roger Revelle. Roger Revelle would have been 100 years old tomorrow. We are live in La Jolla. I'm Tom Jordan, KUSI News.
Thanks, Tom. John Coleman believes there is no significant man-made global warming, and he travels the nation speaking on the topic.
And at that point, I got the opportunity for the first time to tell the story of Roger Revelle and that global warming campaign on television. And now today, standing here before you, I wonder, where would Roger Revelle be today if he were alive? Here in Las Vegas, sitting proudly beside my great hero, Fred Singer, and joining this conference and probably receiving an award here? Or would he be somewhere sequestered and hiding with Al Gore, talking about we skeptics, we deniers, we ugly flat earthers, and the tons and tons of carbon that we are emitting into the atmosphere and destroying the climate of Earth? Where would Roger Revelle be today? I think I would be able to look down and say, Dr. Revelle, we honor you. As I conclude my presentation, I would like to take just a moment to speak to those probably not in this room, but those who are watching streaming or perhaps watching the rebroadcast of this on C-SPAN or on YouTube. Young people who love this earth and who wonder if we who deny global warming are destroying our planet. I want you to know that we, all of us here today, honor and love this planet as much as you do. Its water and its air are precious to us, and preserving it is vital to us. And if we thought that our activity in having this magnificent civilization of cell phones and computers and smart TVs and jet airplanes and fancy cars, if we thought heating and air conditioning and computer communication so we could read Wikipedia or look something up on Google, if we thought that was destroying our climate, we would stop. And when I speak about this and tell these young people about my love of Earth, they say to me, okay, let's say you're right, that there isn't any global warming crisis. But still, shouldn't we, to protect our environment, get rid of fossil fuels? And I say to them, that day will come, and I look forward to it as much as you. Yes, but as 30 years from now, it has to do perhaps with thorium and graphene. It has to do with the scientific breakthroughs. And if we took that $2.5 billion a year that we're wasting studying the climate impact on insects today and other such silliness, and put it into research to find new 21st century forms of energy, that time might not be 30 years, but might be 15. But look how much we've cleaned the atmosphere already with our reformulated gasoline, with our totally redone injection systems and catalytic converters making internal combustion engines burn relatively cleanly. We have come so far. Support the scientists, and we will all love planet Earth together. Thank you for letting me speak here today. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.